In February 1951, a photograph was taken outside the Marble Palace in Tehran that would appear on the front pages of newspapers across Europe and North America. It showed a young woman in a wedding dress embroidered with approximately 40,000 diamonds. She was 18 years old. She was smiling. The photographers had asked her to turn slightly to the left, and she had complied. What the photograph did not show was that she had been ill with typhoid fever 6 weeks earlier and had nearly died before the wedding could take place. The ceremony had already been postponed once. There was quiet pressure from the court that it should not be postponed again. The dress weighed nearly 40 pounds. She stood in it for several hours. The world that received that photograph saw a fairy tale, a beautiful girl from a noble family, chosen by a king, elevated to empress of one of the oldest continuous monarchies on earth. The image moved across wire services and into magazine covers, and in the years that followed, Soraya Esfandiary-Bakhtiary would become one of the most photographed women of the 20th century, her face appearing alongside Grace Kelly and Audrey Hepburn in the visual vocabulary of mid-century glamour. But the photograph was taken at the beginning of something, and the story of what followed does not resemble the image that launched it. This is an account of the 50 years after that picture was taken. The court she entered, the pressures applied to her there, the manner in which she was removed, and the life she lived afterward in European cities that had no particular use for a former empress with a fixed income and nowhere specific to be. Soraya Esfandiary-Bakhtiary was born on June 22, 1932, in Isfahan, Iran. Her father, Khalil Esfandiary, came from the Bakhtiari Tribal Confederation, one of the most politically significant tribal groups in Iran's modern history, a people whose horsemen had marched on Tehran in 1909 to restore the constitutional monarchy, and whose loyalties various governments had been trying to manage ever since. Her mother, Eva Karl, was a German woman from Berlin who had met Khalil while he was posted abroad. Soraya was their second child. The Bakhtiari were not ordinary nobility. They were something older and less stable than that, a confederation of clans whose power had always rested on land, livestock, and the credible threat of armed resistance. By the time Soraya was born, that power was in managed decline. The Pahlavi dynasty, established by Reza Shah in 1925, had spent considerable effort dismantling the autonomous authority of Iran's tribal federations, disarming their fighters, and pulling their leaders into the orbit of the central government, where they could be watched. Khalil Esfandiary had made the necessary accommodations. He was educated, cosmopolitan, and later served as Iran's ambassador to West Germany. He understood which direction things were moving. What this meant for Soraya, practically, was that she grew up between worlds in a way that was not poetic, but logistical. She spent her early childhood partly in Isfahan, partly in Tehran, and from the age of 9 onward primarily in Europe, first in Switzerland, where she was enrolled at a boarding school in Montreux, and later in England. She learned French and German before her Persian became fully fluent. She learned to present herself according to European standards of comportment and education. The schools she attended were the kind that produced women who knew how to enter a room, how to address a formal dinner table, and how to conduct themselves in the company of people who considered their own manners a form of social currency. This education was not incidental. It was preparation, though for what exactly remained unspecified during the years she was receiving it. Her father's social circle understood that a well-formed daughter from a distinguished Iranian family with European polish was a particular kind of asset. What form that asset would eventually take was not yet clear. But the shaping had begun. She was 16 when the process became explicit. In 1948, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who had been on the peacock throne since 1941, when the Allied occupation of Iran had forced his father's abdication, was in need of a new wife. His first marriage to Princess Fawzia of Egypt had ended in divorce the previous year. The official reason given was incompatibility. The unofficial pressure was the same that would define Soraya's years in the palace. Fawzia had produced one child, a daughter, and the court required a male heir. The search for a second empress was not conducted the way it would be described in the European press, which preferred the language of romance and destiny. It was conducted the way significant institutional decisions were conducted, through networks of family connection, political calculation, and careful assessment of candidates. Was several young women from appropriate families were considered. Photographs were reviewed, backgrounds were examined. The criteria were not secret. The woman needed to be of suitable lineage, young enough to bear children over many years, educated enough to represent Iran on the international stage, and this was stated plainly in some accounts from people close to the court, attractive enough to be photographed well, because by the late 1940s the Shah understood that his image abroad was partly constructed through the international press, and a photogenic empress was a diplomatic instrument. Soraya was introduced into this process through her father's connections. She was 17, living in London at the time, studying at a language school. A mutual acquaintance arranged for her photograph to be seen by people close to the Shah. The photograph was approved. A meeting was arranged. The meeting took place in 1950. The Shah saw her. Within weeks, an engagement had been announced. In her memoir, published in 1963, Soraya wrote about this period with a careful flatness that is itself revealing. She described the introduction, the meetings, the engagement, and she described her own feelings in language that was notably thin, as if she had not yet developed the vocabulary for what she was experiencing or had decided that deploying it in print would cost her something. She wrote that she had found the Shah attractive. She wrote that it had all happened very quickly. She did not write about being consulted. What she did write about, in slightly more detail, was the period between the engagement and the wedding, the months in which she was prepared for the role she was about to assume. She was given instruction in court protocol. She was briefed on the structure of the imperial household. She was fitted repeatedly for the clothes she would need. She learned which forms of address were required for which categories of person. She was told what would be expected of her publicly and privately. She was told about the importance of producing an heir. She was 18 years old when this instruction began. She had not finished her education in London. She did not return to finish it. The typhoid came in January 1951, 6 weeks before the wedding date. She contracted it and became seriously ill, ill enough that there was genuine uncertainty about whether she would recover in time. The wedding had already been planned, the invitations sent, the international press preparing to descend on Tehran. The dress, which had been in construction for months under the direction of the French fashion house, Yves Saint Laurent's predecessor firm, was already finished. The diamonds had already been sewn. When she recovered, the wedding proceeded. She had lost weight during the illness, and the dress, already heavy, now hung slightly differently than it had been designed to. Adjustments were made in the final days. The wedding itself took place on February 12th, 1951, in the Marble Palace in Tehran. It was attended by dignitaries from across the diplomatic world and covered by press photographers from Europe and America. The images that went out across the wire services that evening showed a young woman in an extraordinary dress, standing beside a man 11 years her senior in a palace built by his father. In those images, she is composed. The composure is visible as effort if you look at it long enough, but almost no one was looking at it that way. What people saw was the dress, the diamonds, the palace, the king. What they saw was the picture they had expected to see. The girl in it had been assembled over the course of roughly 2 years for exactly this purpose. Whether she understood the full weight of what she had entered, the specific nature of the institution she had joined, its demands, its internal politics, its particular definition of what a woman in her position was for, would become clear in the years immediately following. The court did not wait long to begin making that definition plain. The Marble Palace, in the weeks after the wedding, was not what the photographs suggested. The international press had filed their images and moved on to other stories. The diplomats had returned to their embassies. The flowers had been cleared from the ceremonial halls. What remained was the ordinary structure of the imperial court. Its staff, its protocols, its hierarchies, and its unspoken but thoroughly understood rules about who held authority over what. Soraya was now Empress of Iran. The title was real. The power it implied was not. The imperial household operated according to systems that had been in place long before she arrived, and that did not reorganize themselves around her presence. There were chamberlains, ladies-in-waiting, secretaries, and advisors who had spent years or decades in their positions, and who understood the court's internal logic in ways that a 19-year-old woman, however well prepared, could not immediately grasp. The staff were formally deferential. They called her by her title. They responded to her requests, and they reported through the channels available to them to the people who actually managed the daily functioning of the palace, people whose loyalty was institutional rather than personal, and who had outlasted one empress already. The Shah himself was not a simple figure to be close to. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was 31 years old at the time of the wedding, 11 years older than Soraya, and he had been navigating the extraordinary pressures of his position since he was 21. Ascending to the throne in the middle of a wartime foreign occupation, ruling a country whose oil resources had made it a permanent object of British and American strategic interest, managing a parliament, a nationalist movement, a communist party, a clerical establishment, and a tribal periphery that required constant, careful management. He was intelligent, politically experienced in the particular way that survival in dangerous circumstances produces, and emotionally guarded in ways that the people closest to him consistently noted but rarely described in direct terms. He was also a man who had grown up in a court that treated women's roles in very specific ways. His mother, his sisters, his first wife had all occupied defined positions whose boundaries were set not by their own preferences but by the institution's requirements. Soraya entered this environment as his wife, and the warmth she described in their early relationship in her memoir does not contradict the structural reality. She was there to perform a function, and the function was biological before it was anything else. This was stated in formal terms almost immediately. Within months of the wedding, the question of an heir had moved from background expectation to active discussion. The court's need for a male successor was not a private concern. It was a dynastic and political one. The Pahlavi dynasty was only 26 years old. It had no deep roots of the kind that gave older monarchies their apparent permanence. Mohammad Reza Shah's legitimacy rested on a combination of constitutional authority, military loyalty, foreign support, and the symbolic weight of the throne itself. A secure line of succession was not a luxury. It was structural. Soraya was aware of this before she married. She had been told. But there is a difference between being told something and living inside its daily weight. And the difference became apparent as months passed without a pregnancy. In 1952, roughly a year into the marriage, the political situation in Iran underwent a crisis that temporarily displaced the question of succession with something more immediately urgent. Mohammad Mossadegh, the nationalist prime minister who had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company the previous year, was consolidating popular support in ways that directly threatened the Shah's authority. The constitutional struggle between the monarchy and the parliament that year was not abstract. It produced genuine uncertainty about whether the Shah would remain on the throne at all. In August 1953, following the CYA and MI6 organized coup known as Operation Ajax, Mossadegh was removed and the Shah's authority was restored. During the brief period when the coup's outcome was uncertain, the Shah and Soraya had actually left Iran, flying first to Baghdad and then to Rome, where they waited in a hotel while events in Tehran resolved themselves. The Rome interlude was covered by the press as a kind of romantic exile. The king and his beautiful empress, uncertain of their future, photographed entering and leaving their hotel. The images were striking. The reality was that the Shah was waiting to learn whether he still had a country to return to, and Soraya was waiting beside him because she had nowhere else to be. They returned to Tehran after the coup succeeded. The Shah's position was now more secure than it had been since he took the throne, underwritten by American support and with Mossadegh under house arrest. The political crisis had passed. The question of succession returned to the foreground with renewed urgency. What followed over the next several years was a sustained and largely private ordeal. Soraya did not become pregnant. The medical consultations began, discreet at first, then less so as time passed and the court's patience contracted. She was examined by Iranian physicians, then by European specialists brought in at considerable expense. Various treatments were attempted. None produced results. Whether the difficulty was hers, the Shah's, or some combination was a question that the court's framing consistently answered in one direction. The problem was located in her. This framing was not openly stated in public. It did not need to be. The court's internal communications, the whisper networks among the ladies-in-waiting, the carefully worded diplomatic dispatches that discussed the succession question, these all circulated the same assumption. She was the variable. The Shah had been married before. He had fathered a child. The logic, such as it was, pointed at Soraya. In her memoir, she wrote about this period with a restrained precision that is, on close reading, quite devastating. And she described attending official functions while knowing that the conversation in certain rooms turned, when she had left, to the matter of her failure. She described the medical procedures, the examinations, the treatments, the monitoring, in language that was clinical and almost detached, as if the distance were protective. She wrote about a particular visit to a European clinic, the details of which she declined to specify, where she was told that her chances of conceiving might be improved by a certain course of treatment. She undertook the treatment. It did not work. Meanwhile, the public image continued its independent existence. The photographs kept appearing. Soraya at a state dinner. Soraya at a hospital estate dinner. Soraya at a hospital opening. Soraya in a Dior dress at a Paris reception. Soraya on the cover of Paris Match of Life. Of a dozen other publications whose readers had no access to what was happening in the private corridors of the question about her body and its usefulness to the state. The Shah, for his part, appears from the historical record to have maintained genuine affection for her during these years. Letters that have been quoted in various accounts suggest a man who found her company genuinely valued. But affection and institutional requirement are not the same force. And by the mid-1950s, the institutional requirement had acquired a momentum of its own, fed by advisors, by the court's senior figures, by foreign diplomats who understood the succession question as a stability issue, and by the Shah's own awareness that the dynasty's future could not wait indefinitely for a biological outcome that showed no sign of arriving. By 1957, the discussions about what to do had moved beyond the medical. The question being asked in the relevant rooms was no longer whether a pregnancy might still occur. It was what happened if it did not, and specifically, whether the Shah might be permitted under Islamic law to take a second wife, or whether a divorce and remarriage offered a cleaner resolution. Soraya was not invited to these discussions. She learned about them through the same indirect channels that most of what was decided about her life reached her, through shifts in the behavior of the people around her, through conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, through the particular quality of attention the Shah showed her during this period, which she described in her memoir as tender in a way that, in retrospect, she understood differently than she had at the time. The marriage that had been announced to the world as a love story had always been, in its structural foundations, a contractual arrangement between a young woman's family and a state institution. The contract had a primary clause. The clause had not been fulfilled. The institution was now moving with the measured deliberateness of something that has made a decision and is implementing it carefully toward the next step. Soraya was 25 years old. She had been empress for 7 years. She had been photographed hundreds of times. She had attended state functions, represented Iran at international events, sat beside her husband at dinners for heads of state. She had learned the court's language, its manners, its silences. None of it had produced the thing the court required of her, and the court had now decided what to do about that. The Marble Palace, where Soraya and the Shah maintained their primary Tehran residence, was built in the 1930s under Reza Shah's directive as a modernizing statement. Its architecture, a deliberate hybrid of European neoclassical proportion and Persian decorative detail. Its materials imported at significant expense. Its gardens designed to suggest the kind of ordered abundance that a dynasty in the process of constructing its own legitimacy needed to project. By the time Soraya arrived there as empress in 1951, it had been inhabited for roughly 15 years and had already accumulated the particular atmosphere of a place built to impress rather than to shelter. Large rooms with high ceilings that were cold in winter, formal gardens that required constant staff to maintain, corridors that connected spaces designed for ceremony rather than daily life. She also spent considerable time at the Sadabad Palace complex in the foothills north of Tehran, a larger estate used for summer residence, and at Naushar on the Caspian coast. The movement between these residences followed the court calendar, which itself followed the logic of state function rather than personal preference. Where the empress lived at any given moment was determined by where the Shah needed to be, and when he needed to be there, and what the occasion required in terms of setting. This is not a minor detail. The physical movement of Soraya's life, the palaces, the residences, the hotels during official travel, was entirely externally determined. She did not choose where she lived. She did not choose when she moved. She did not choose, in any meaningful sense, who she spent her days with. The ladies-in-waiting assigned to her were not chosen by her either. They were appointed through court channels, drawn from families whose social position made them suitable for proximity to the empress, and their presence was constant in the way that surveillance is constant when it has been built into the architecture of daily life. They accompanied her to appointments, to fittings, to official engagements. They were present during the hours of her day that had no official function. They were, by the nature of their position, people whose reports of her behavior, her mood, her statements, and her health reached the court's information networks, whether or not that was their conscious intention. Soraya wrote in her memoir about the difficulty of finding privacy inside the palace, and the word she used in the French in which she wrote was something closer to solitude. And the distinction matters. She was not simply looking for time alone in the physical sense, though that was difficult enough. She was looking for a space in which she was not being observed and assessed. That space did not exist in the imperial court in any reliable form. Her correspondence was not private. This was not a secret. It was simply the understood condition of living at the center of a security apparatus that treated information about the royal household as a matter of state concern. The Shah's intelligence services, which would eventually consolidate into SAVAK in 1957, maintained extensive monitoring of communications in and around the court. Letters Soraya sent and received passed through channels that were not entirely her own. The people she spoke with understood this. She understood it. It shaped what was said, what was written, and what was left deliberately unspoken. Social contact outside the court's defined circles was limited by protocol in ways that effectively prevented the formation of ordinary friendships. The women Soraya might have spent time with in a different life, women her own age, women with interests or experiences she shared, were not accessible to her in the casual, unstructured way that friendship requires. Any contact with people outside the approved circle was mediated by the apparatus of the court, arranged in advance, attended by staff, conducted under the understanding that the empress's behavior in any social setting was a representation of the imperial household. She was 19 when she entered this environment, and she had spent her adolescence in European boarding schools and in London in environments that, whatever their own constraints, had permitted her a degree of social freedom, the ability to form friendships, to move through a city, to have experiences that were not monitored and reported. The transition from that life to the palace was a transition into a form of enclosure that was all the more complete for being invisible. There were no walls she could point to. There was simply the structure, everywhere, of a life in which every movement had a function and every relationship had a protocol. The public engagements that filled her calendar were not, for the most part, activities she had chosen or found meaningful. She opened hospitals, she attended receptions, she sat beside the Shah at state dinners for visiting heads of government. She appeared at ceremonies marking national occasions. She wore the clothes that had been selected and fitted and prepared for these occasions. She said the things that were appropriate to say. She was photographed doing all of it. In 1954, she accompanied the Shah on an official visit to the United States, where they were received by President Eisenhower at the White House. The visit was extensively photographed and covered by the American press, which was broadly favorable. The Shah was an American-supported leader in a strategically critical country, and the coverage reflected that. Soraya appeared in photographs alongside Eisenhower and his wife, in photographs at official dinners and photographs arriving and departing. She wore American designers on some occasions and European ones on others. She was described in the press coverage in terms that focused on her appearance, her clothes, her poise. One major American magazine ran a feature on her wardrobe. What the coverage did not address was what she was doing in Washington in any sense other than decorative. She had no official role in the diplomatic discussions. She attended the social functions surrounding the state visit. She represented Iran in the specific way that a beautiful empress in the right dress represents a country, as an image, as a signal that the government producing her was sophisticated enough to produce her. Back in Tehran, the rhythm of the court continued. The seasons changed. The residences changed. The calendar of engagements continued. And underneath all of it, steadily and without pause, the question of the heir continued to accumulate pressure. And there were aspects of the court's internal life that created specific and documented difficulties for Soraya beyond the general condition of surveillance and constraint. The Shah's sisters, particularly Princess Ashraf, his twin, who was one of the most politically active and personally formidable members of the Pahlavi family, were significant presences in the court whose relationships with Soraya were, by multiple accounts, not warm. Ashraf was not a woman who occupied a decorative role. She had her own political interests, her own networks, her own perspective on how the imperial household should be managed and who should have influence within it. The arrival of a new empress who was young, foreign-educated, and publicly celebrated as the most beautiful woman in the court was not, in Ashraf's world, an uncomplicated development. And the tensions between Soraya and the Shah's family were not the subject of public reporting during this period. They surfaced occasionally in diplomatic dispatches, and later in memoirs written by people who had been present. What they describe is not dramatic confrontation, but the subtler, more sustained difficulty of a young woman trying to establish herself in a family institution whose existing members had no particular interest in making room for her, and whose influence over the Shah predated her arrival by decades. By the mid-1950s, Soraya had been empress for 4 years and had not produced an heir. The medical consultations were ongoing. The court's patience was visibly contracting, and she was living inside a structure, physical, social, informational, that offered her no independent ground to stand on. And she had staff who served her. She had clothes made for her by the best houses in Paris. She had jewels from the imperial treasury that were among the finest in the world. She traveled in aircraft and motorcades. She was addressed by everyone around her with the full formality of her title. And she had no friends she had chosen herself, no correspondence that was entirely her own, no room in the palace she had decorated according to her own taste without consultation, no morning she woke to that had not been organized in advance by people whose primary loyalty was to the institution rather than to her. The enclosure was not the palace walls. The enclosure was the total organization of her existence around a purpose she had not set and could not renegotiate, inside a structure she had entered at 18 and that had no provision for her having preferences that conflicted with its requirements. She was 23 years old in 1955. She had learned by then to conduct herself inside this structure with a composure that the photographs consistently show. The composure was real in the sense that it had been thoroughly practiced. Whether it was real in any other sense is a question the photographs cannot answer. In the winter of 1954, a German gynecologist named Dr. Karl Gebhardt was brought to Tehran at the request of the imperial court. He was not the first specialist to be consulted, and he would not be the last. But his arrival marked a shift in the nature of the medical process surrounding Soraya, a shift from the relatively discreet consultations of the early marriage years towards something more systematic, more externally organized and more explicitly framed as a problem requiring solution within a defined time frame. The fact that a foreign specialist had been summoned was itself a communication. It told the court and told Soraya that the matter had moved beyond the capacity of Iranian medicine to resolve and beyond the category of private concern. It had become, in the language of the institution, a project. Gebhardt conducted his examinations and offered his assessments. The details of what he found and what he recommended were not made public at the time and remain partially unclear from the surviving record. But what is clear is that his visit did not produce the outcome the court was hoping for, and that, after his departure, the consultations continued, with other specialists in other cities, following other protocols, in a process that extended across several years, and that Soraya later described in her memoir with a flatness of affect that reads, in retrospect, as the emotional posture of someone who has learned to survive a sustained and intimate humiliation by refusing to fully inhabit it. The medical process she was subjected to during these years was not, by the standards of the time, unusual in its clinical specifics. What was unusual was its context, the fact that it was being conducted not in response to a woman's own desire for children or her own concern about her health, but in response to an institutional requirement that her body produce a particular biological outcome on a schedule determined by political necessity. She was being treated as a variable in a dynastic equation, and the treatments being applied to her were attempts to adjust that variable toward the required value. She was, during this period, also continuing to perform all the functions of her public role. The state dinners, the hospital openings, the official travel, the photographs, these continued without interruption. The public image of the Empress was maintained in parallel with the private medical process, and the two tracks of her existence ran alongside each other without the public one acknowledging the private one in any way. In 1955, she and the Shah traveled to Europe, a trip that combined official engagements with medical consultations in Switzerland and Germany. The trip was covered by the press as a state visit with a holiday component. Photographs of the couple in Geneva, in Munich, looking like what they were supposed to look like. The medical purpose of the European stop was not mentioned in the coverage. It was not a secret exactly. The people who needed to know knew, but it had not entered the public narrative, which was still operating in the register of the 1951 wedding photographs. The Swiss clinic she visited during this trip was the kind of institution that catered to wealthy patients who required discretion as much as treatment. The discretion was maintained. The treatment, again, did not produce the desired result. Back in Tehran, the atmosphere in the court was shifting in ways that Soraya registered through the behavior of the people around her, rather than through direct communication. The ladies-in-waiting who had always been formally warm became, in some cases, slightly more formal in a way that suggested a withdrawal of investment. The subtle social recalibration of people who are beginning to adjust their positioning relative to someone whose future in the institution is becoming uncertain. The Shah's mother, Taj ul-Muluk, had never been an ally, and by this period her communications about the succession question were less guarded than they had been in the early years of the marriage. The Shah's own behavior towards Soraya during this period is described inconsistently in the various accounts that exist. Some sources, including Soraya's own memoir, suggest that he remained personally affectionate while being increasingly unable to insulate her from the institutional pressure. Other sources, drawing on court gossip and diplomatic dispatches, suggest that his attention was not entirely concentrated on Soraya during these years, that the combination of the succession anxiety and the broader pressures of his political position had produced in him a kind of compartmentalization in which the personal and the institutional were managed separately and did not communicate well with each other. What is documented is that by 1956, the Shah had begun receiving formal advice from court officials and religious advisors about his options regarding the succession. Islamic law, as practiced in Iran at the time, permitted a man to take a second wife under certain circumstances. And the circumstance of an empress who had not produced an heir was being discussed in these consultations as a potential qualifying condition. This was not yet being communicated to Soraya directly, but the discussions were happening in rooms she was not in, among people she saw daily, and the change in the social atmosphere of the court was a form of communication even without explicit words. She was 24 years old in 1956. She had been undergoing medical treatment for her fertility for at least 2 years, possibly longer. She had attended, in that time, dozens of public functions at which she had been photographed and described in terms of her beauty, her elegance, and her grace. She had opened a pediatric ward at a Tehran hospital and been photographed surrounded by children in a composition that, given what was happening privately, had a quality that the photographer almost certainly did not intend. There was a particular public engagement in 1956 that appears in the photographic record, and that carries, in retrospect, a weight the images themselves do not signal. It was a formal reception at which Soraya appeared in a gown from a Parisian house, her hair arranged by the court staff, her jewelry from the imperial collection. The photographs show her standing beside the Shah, her posture correct, her expression composed, her eyes directed at the correct angle for the cameras. She looks exactly like an empress is supposed to look. At the time these photographs were taken, her body had been the subject of medical examination and intervention for the better part of 3 years. The question of whether it would perform the function the state required of it was being discussed in formal consultations among the Shah's advisors. Her position in the institution she had entered at 18 was becoming, quietly and without announcement, contingent. The medical consultations had one further significant iteration. In early 1957, the Shah arranged for Soraya to travel to a specialist in Frankfurt, a consultation that was, by this point, understood by both of them to be something close to a final assessment rather than an ongoing treatment. The Frankfurt specialist conducted his examination and delivered his findings. The specifics of what he said to Soraya directly are not recorded. What is recorded is that she returned to Tehran afterward, and that shortly after her return, the conversations that had been happening in rooms she was not in began, for the first time, to reach her directly. The Shah spoke to her. The accounts of this conversation differ in their details. Soraya's memoir version, written years later in France, has a particular quality of restraint that may reflect the difficulty of reconstructing it accurately, or the decision not to fully reconstruct it in a public document. What all accounts agree on is that the conversation concerned the question of what would happen next, that the word divorce was present in it in some form, and that Soraya did not contest the institutional logic being presented to her. She did not contest it because there was nothing to contest it with. The institutional logic was not wrong on its own terms. She had not produced an heir. The dynasty required one. The Shah was the Shah, and the court was the court, and she was a woman who had entered this institution at 18 with a single primary function and had not fulfilled it. The logic was circular and total, and she had been living inside it long enough to know its shape from every angle. What she felt about it is something the memoir approaches and then deflects. She wrote about the Frankfurt trip. She wrote about returning to Tehran. She wrote, in general terms, about understanding that things had reached a point of resolution. She did not write, in any direct form, about what it was like to be 24 years old and to have your body's failure publicly discussed as a matter of state consequence. While the photographs on the front pages of European magazines continued to show an empress at the height of her visible splendor, the two tracks of her existence, the public image and the private reality, had been running in parallel for years. By early 1957, they were about to converge. The formal decision to end the marriage was made in the first weeks of 1958. It was made by the Shah, in consultation with his advisors in the context of the institutional requirements that had been building pressure for the better part of 4 years. The decision was communicated to Soraya directly by the Shah in a private conversation at the palace. By multiple accounts, including her own, she did not argue against it. She had known it was coming long enough that its arrival was not a shock in the conventional sense. It was the completion of a process she had been watching approach for years, the way you watch weather move across a landscape when there is no shelter available and no direction to walk that takes you away from it faster than it is moving toward you. What followed the private conversation was a sequence of events whose management revealed, with considerable clarity, the nature of the institution she had been part of for 7 years. The Shah's press office prepared a public announcement. The announcement was coordinated with the court's communications channels and with the relevant foreign diplomatic missions, who needed to be informed before the news became public. The language of the announcement was carefully constructed. It cited no fault, assigned no blame, and framed the divorce as a mutual decision made with sadness by two people who retained affection for each other, but whose situation required this resolution for reasons the announcement gestured toward without specifying directly. The announcement was released to the press on March 14, 1958. There is a specific and documented detail about the timing of this release that appears in multiple accounts of the period, and that the official framing of the announcement does not address. The public announcement of the divorce, the release to international wire services, the notification to foreign press, went out before Soraya had been formally informed of its specific terms and before she had left the palace. Several accounts, including reporting from journalists who were covering the Iranian court at the time, indicate that some foreign news organizations received the announcement and began filing their stories, while Soraya was still physically present in the Marble Palace, in the process of being informed of what was happening and what would happen next. The sequencing, institution first, woman second, but was not accidental. It reflected the court's understanding of what mattered and in what order. The management of the international press narrative, the coordination with diplomatic missions, the control of the announcement's framing, these were the primary operational concerns. Soraya's experience of learning what had been decided about her life was a secondary matter, managed around the primary operational timeline rather than the other way around. When she left Tehran on March 15, 1958, the day after the announcement, she flew to Europe. The departure was covered by photographers at Mehrabad Airport, images that show her in a dark coat moving through the terminal, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who is aware of being photographed in a moment of private devastation and has decided, by training and by the deeply internalized habit of 7 years, to give the cameras nothing they can use. The photographs were published across Europe and America within hours. They ran alongside the announcement of the divorce. The combination, the beautiful empress, the dark coat, the airport, the finality, produced exactly the kind of image that sells magazines, and it sold them in considerable quantities. Paris Match, which had been publishing photographs of Soraya since her wedding, ran a cover. Life magazine ran a spread. The European press, which had been following her since 1951 as a figure of glamour and romantic narrative, now pivoted to covering her as a figure of romantic tragedy, and the pivot required almost no adjustment in the underlying approach. The same cameras, the same angles, the same interest in her face and her clothes, now reframed as documentation of loss rather than celebration of elevation. What she had was this: a financial settlement that the Shah had arranged, consisting of a monthly allowance reported at the time to be somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000, paid from the imperial treasury for the remainder of her life. She had her personal jewelry, the pieces that were hers rather than the court's. Oh, she had her passport, now no longer imperial. She had a suitcase, or several. She had no country that was specifically hers to return to, no family home in the conventional sense, no established life outside the institution she had just been removed from. She was 25 years old. The settlement was generous by any ordinary measure. It was sufficient to maintain a life of considerable material comfort. Apartments in European capitals, travel, clothes, the the kind of existence that the word luxury describes without difficulty. This was understood by the court, and by Soraya, and by the press that reported on it, and it shaped how the divorce was publicly framed. The generosity of the settlement functioned as a form of closure in the institutional narrative. It signaled that the Shah had fulfilled his obligations, that the matter had been handled correctly, that there was nothing more to be addressed. What the settlement could not address, and what the institutional framing had no language for, was what had actually been taken from her. Not the title, though the title was gone, not the palaces, though she would not live in them again. What had been taken was the 7 years she had spent in a role that had organized every aspect of her existence around a purpose she had not set, in an institution she had entered as a teenager and that had now finished with her and released her into a world that had no particular structure for what she was supposed to do next. She had been prepared, with considerable thoroughness, to be the Empress of Iran. She had not been prepared to be a 25-year-old former empress with a monthly allowance and no defined role and no country and no plan. In the days immediately following the announcement, the public response in Iran was significant. There were people in Tehran who wept openly. Soraya had been a visible public figure for 7 years, and the combination of her beauty, her composure at public functions, and the romantic narrative the court and the press had jointly maintained around her marriage had produced a genuine popular affection that was not simply manufactured. Ordinary Iranians had followed her story in the way people follow figures whose lives represent something larger than the particulars. In her case, a kind of beauty and elevation that the 1951 wedding photographs had made available as a shared cultural image. But the grief of the Iranian public at the divorce was reported in the international press with a note of slight surprise, as if it were unexpected that people would feel strongly about the end of a royal marriage. It was not unexpected. The image of Soraya had been carefully produced and widely distributed for 7 years, and people had invested in it the way people invest in images that are beautiful and seemingly stable. The divorce ended that stability, and the response was proportionate to the investment. In Tehran, a rumor circulated in the weeks after the announcement that Soraya had been seen weeping on the steps of the palace before her departure. The rumor was widely repeated and widely believed. It may or may not have been accurate. The sources for it are not reliable in the documentary sense. But its circulation said something about what people needed from the story at that moment. A confirmation that behind the composure, behind the dark coat and the controlled expression at the airport, there had been a human response that the cameras had not captured. Whether she wept on the palace steps or not, she was photographed at the airport, and the airport photographs were what the world received. In them, she is moving forward, as she had always been photographed moving, toward the car, toward the camera, toward the entrance of the reception, toward the next function on the calendar. In the airport photographs, she is moving toward the aircraft. The direction is the same. The destination is different. She landed in Rome. She checked into a hotel. The allowance from the Shah would begin arriving in the coming weeks. The press photographers who had followed her to the airport in Tehran had colleagues waiting in Rome who had been informed of her arrival time. The coverage continued without interruption because, from the press's perspective, nothing had ended. A story had simply changed its register, from the register of the fairy tale to the register of what happens after, which in some respects is the more durable kind of story. She had no staff now except those she hired herself. She had no calendar organized by the court. She had no function to perform, no engagement to attend, no role that required her presence anywhere at any specific time. For 7 years, every hour of her existence had been structured by an institution that required her to be somewhere and do something and look a particular way while doing it. The structure was gone. What replaced it was time, unorganized, unobligated, and entirely hers in a way that nothing had been entirely hers since she was a teenager in London before a mutual acquaintance had arranged for her photograph to be seen by people close to the Shah. The time was real. The freedom it implied was also real in the technical sense. What it was not was a life. It was the absence of the structure that had, for better and for worse, constituted her life. And the absence at 25, with a hotel room in Rome and a monthly allowance and photographers outside, was not the same thing as having somewhere to go. The Hotel Hassler in Rome sits at the top of the Spanish Steps. And in the spring of 1958, it was the kind of establishment where a former empress with a monthly allowance and no fixed destination could exist without particular comment. Rome in that period had a specific capacity for absorbing displaced aristocracy and exiled royalty. The city had been doing it since the 19th century, and its social infrastructure, its press corps, its cafes, and its couture boutiques had all developed accommodations for people whose titles had become decorative and whose wealth remained functional. Soraya arrived into this environment at 25 and found that it received her without difficulty, which was itself a kind of information about what she had become. She was no longer the Empress of Iran. She was, in the language that the European press quickly settled on, the former Empress of Iran, a formulation that kept the title present while marking its past tense, that maintained the glamour of the association while signaling the tragedy of the loss. It was a useful formulation for the magazines, which could continue publishing her photographs under a narrative that had acquired, if anything, more emotional texture than the wedding and coronation story. Tragedy is a more durable register than triumph. The readers who had followed her ascent were now offered her fall, and the fall was being documented with the same camera angles and the same attention to her clothes and her face that had always characterized the coverage. She moved between cities in the months following the divorce. Rome first, then Paris, then back to Rome, with periods in Switzerland and Germany that were partly social and partly the continuation of the medical consultations that had not stopped simply because the institutional reason for them had been resolved. The movement was not purposeful in the way that travel with a destination is purposeful. It was the movement of someone who has no fixed place and is filling the absence of structure with the activity of displacement, going somewhere else because staying in the same place too long would require confronting the absence more directly. In Paris, she took an apartment on the Avenue Montaigne, a street whose particular combination of couture houses, expensive hotels, and discreet residential buildings was well suited to the kind of life she was assembling. A life whose external appointments were impeccable and whose internal organization was, in the late 1950s, almost entirely absent. The apartment was furnished with the kind of careful attention to surface that suggests a person trying to construct, through objects and arrangements, a sense of inhabitation that has not yet arrived organically. The furniture was good. The art on the walls was appropriate. The whole thing looked, by the accounts of people who visited during this period, like a place where someone was staying rather than a place where someone lived. The allowance from the Shah arrived regularly. It was enough, more than enough by almost any measure. She could maintain the apartment in Paris, travel when she chose, buy the clothes that the photographers expected her to be wearing when they found her, eat in the restaurants that her former status made appropriate. The material comfort was genuine and continuous. What it purchased, in terms of daily existence, was a life whose every surface was correct and whose interior had been hollowed out by the removal of the structure that had previously organized it. She was not entirely without social contact. The European social world of the late 1950s, the circuit of parties, openings, resort towns, and carefully managed introductions that constituted the upper register of international society, received her as it received any beautiful, wealthy, and slightly tragic figure. She was invited to things. She attended some of them. She was photographed at most of the ones she attended, because the photographers had understood by now that she would continue to appear in public, that her face continued to sell covers, and that the story of the former empress who was still beautiful and still wearing the right clothes in the right places was a story with ongoing commercial value that did not require much new information to sustain itself. The social world she moved through was not, however, one she could fully inhabit. The women she met at these events were mostly wives, women whose social position was organized around a husband, a household, a set of defined functions that gave their presence at a dinner party or a gallery opening a context and a continuity. Soraya had none of that context. She was present as herself, which in practice meant present as the image the photographers had been constructing since 1951. Beautiful, composed, formerly imperial, currently available to be looked at and photographed and discussed. She was a figure in the room rather than a participant in it. The men who approached her during this period did so under conditions that were, from her position, almost universally unsatisfactory. Some were interested in her celebrity, in the reflected status of being seen with the former Empress of Iran. Some were interested in the allowance, which was not a secret and which made her, in the financial calculations of a certain kind of European opportunist, an attractive prospect. Some were interested in her in the ordinary way that men are interested in beautiful women, with no particular awareness of or interest in the specific conditions of her situation. Sorting through these approaches without the social infrastructure that marriage would have provided, the protection of a defined role, the clarity of an established connection, was its own form of labor. The Iranian government's position on her social life was not neutral. The allowance that arrived monthly from the imperial treasury was not accompanied by formal conditions in writing, but the unspoken understanding, communicated through intermediaries, through the Iranian embassy in Paris, through people who had been close to the court and remained connected to it, was that her conduct was observed, and that conduct that embarrassed the Shah or the imperial household would have consequences for the financial arrangement. This was never made explicit in terms she could have cited or contested. It did not need to be explicit. She understood the nature of the dependency she was living inside, and the dependency shaped her behavior in ways that were below the threshold of conscious calculation, but no less real for that. She could not, for instance, enter into a public relationship with a man without the relationship being covered by the press in ways that would immediately reach Tehran. She could not make statements about the Shah, the court, or the circumstances of the divorce that deviated from the careful, non-accusatory framing she had maintained in her public communications since March 1958. She could not behave, in short, in ways that the imperial household would find inconvenient, because the imperial household controlled, through the monthly transfer of funds, the conditions of her material existence. This was the specific architecture of her freedom. She was free to move between cities. She was free to choose her own clothes and her own furniture and her own dinner companions. She was free from the surveillance of the palace, from the ladies-in-waiting who had attended her every hour, from the court calendar that had organized every day. These freedoms were real. She was not free from observation. She was not free from financial dependency on the institution that had discarded her. She was not free, in any practical sense, to construct a public identity that contradicted the one the court had established. The gracious, dignified, a non-complaining former empress who had accepted her situation with the composure that 7 years of training had made second nature. In 1959, the Shah married Farah Diba. The wedding was covered by the same international press apparatus that had covered his wedding to Soraya 8 years earlier. The photographs went out across the wire services. Farah was 21 years old. She was from a family of somewhat less distinguished lineage than Soraya's, but was educated Iranian in a less complicated way than Soraya's half-German background allowed, and, the relevant fact, demonstrably fertile within the first year of the marriage. In 1960, she gave birth to a son, Reza, who was immediately designated Crown Prince. So the birth of the Crown Prince closed the chapter of the succession question in a way that the divorce had only promised to close it. The dynasty now had an heir. The problem that Soraya had represented, or that the court had located in her body, had been resolved by her replacement. The resolution was total and public, and it was communicated to Soraya not through any direct communication from Tehran, but through the same newspapers and magazines that communicated it to everyone else. She read about the birth in Paris. She was 27 years old. The allowance continued to arrive. She had begun, during this period, to think about what else she might do, what form her life might take beyond the maintenance of the image that the photographers continued to document. The options available to her were constrained in ways that were not immediately obvious but became clear on examination. She was not educated beyond her teenage schooling in Switzerland and London. She had no professional training, no developed skill that was deployable in a working context. She had 7 years of experience performing the functions of an empress, which were not transferable in any direct way to a civilian life in Paris or Rome. What she had was her face and the story attached to it. The specific combination of beauty and tragedy and former imperial status that the press had been packaging and selling since 1958. This was not nothing. It was, in fact, a form of currency that had genuine value in the cultural economy of early 1960s Europe. The question of how to deploy it and what deploying it would cost was the question she was beginning to work through in the apartment on the Avenue Montaigne. The answer she arrived at was not the only possible answer, and it was not a straightforward one. It was the answer that the film industry, specifically the Italian film industry, which was in its most commercially and artistically expansive period in the early 1960s, had been suggesting to her through the overtures of producers and directors who had been approaching her since the divorce. She had been offered film roles before. She had declined them, partly from uncertainty, partly from the residual sense that such work was not compatible with the dignity of her former position. By 1961, that constraint had loosened. The former position was 3 years in the past. The dignity it had imposed was increasingly difficult to justify maintaining at the cost of having nothing at all to do. She agreed to make a film. The production that Soraya agreed to join in 1961 was an Italian film called I Tre Volti, Three Faces, a project that had been constructed with considerable deliberateness around the specific cultural fact of her existence. The film's conceit was unusual. It consisted of 3 separate short films linked by the presence of an unnamed princess, played by Soraya, who appeared briefly at the beginning to establish a framing narrative, and whose story, or rather, whose image, connected the 3 otherwise unrelated segments. The project had been developed by the producer Dino De Laurentiis, who understood that what he was purchasing was not an actress, but a face with a story attached to it, and that the story was sufficiently well known across Europe and America that the face alone, placed in the correct context, would generate the press attention that the film required to reach its audience. The director of one of the segments was Michelangelo Antonioni, whose reputation by 1961 had been established by L'Avventura and La Notte, films whose particular investigation of emotional vacancy and the failure of human connection among the wealthy and privileged had made him one of the most discussed directors in European cinema. Antonioni's involvement in the project was not incidental. His sensibility, the long silences, the careful attention to surfaces concealing absences, the examination of beautiful people in beautiful settings who cannot reach each other, was, in a technical sense, well suited to what Soraya's actual situation was. Whether this alignment was conscious on his part, or simply the result of a filmmaker with a consistent set of preoccupations being given a subject who happened to embody them, is not something the record resolves. The filming took place in Rome and its surroundings. Soraya appeared on set and performed what was required of her. The accounts from people present during the production are consistent in describing her as cooperative, professional in her punctuality and her attention to direction, and uncomfortable in ways that she managed with the composure that had become her most reliable instrument. She was not an actress in the trained sense. She had no technique in the formal meaning of the word, no method for reaching emotional states on demand, no experience with the specific discipline of performing a character rather than performing herself. What she had was the thing she had always had, the ability to present a surface that the camera found compelling, the practiced management of her own appearance and expression, the deep familiarity with being looked at that 7 years of imperial public life had produced. The film was released in 1965 after a production and post-production process that stretched considerably longer than originally planned. By the time it reached Italian cinemas, and then limited international distribution, the window of cultural attention that had surrounded Soraya most intensely in the years immediately following the 1958 divorce had contracted somewhat. She was no longer the urgent story she had been in 1958 and 1959. She was still recognizable, still photographed when she appeared in public, still a figure whose name carried the associations the press had built around it. But the acuity of public interest had softened in the way that interest in any specific story softens when the story stops generating new information. The critical reception of I Tre Volti was not cruel, but it was not useful either. Reviewers noted her presence, noted the film's unusual structure, noted Antonioni's segment with the attention his name commanded, and assessed Soraya's performance in language that was careful in the specific way that criticism is careful when it is trying to acknowledge someone's limitations without being unkind about them. The phrases that appeared, natural screen presence, limited range, better suited to being watched than to acting, were not attacks. They were accurate descriptions of what the screen showed, and what the screen showed was a woman who had been trained to be looked at rather than to inhabit a character, performing in a medium that requires, at minimum, the ability to be someone other than yourself. The film did not launch a career. It did not produce further offers of the kind that would have constituted a serious professional trajectory. What it produced was a small number of additional approaches from producers who were interested in the same thing De Laurentiis had been interested in: the face, the story, the guaranteed press coverage, and who had projects of similarly limited ambition that they thought her image could serve. She declined most of these. The few she accepted did not advance beyond early stages of development. The film experiment had answered the question she had been working toward since the apartment on the Avenue Montaigne, the question of whether her image, translated into performance, could become a form of independent existence, a way of being in the world that was hers rather than organized around someone else's requirements. The answer was no, or not in any sustained sense. The image was hers in the way that a photograph is yours. It came from you, it resembled you, but it existed separately and served purposes you did not control. Putting it in a film did not give her control of it. It simply added another venue in which other people could look at it. She was 30 years old when I Tre Volti was released. The decade that had begun with her wedding at 18 had ended with a divorce at 25 and a film that changed nothing material about her situation. The allowance continued to arrive. The apartments continued to be furnished and inhabited. The photographers continued to find her when she appeared in public places. The press continued to describe her as the former Empress of Iran. What the film period had produced beyond the film itself was a different kind of attention. The attention of the Italian cultural world, specifically the film and arts community in Rome that she had been moving through during the production and its aftermath. Rome in the early 1960s had a particular social density in this regard. The Via Veneto culture that Fellini had documented in La Dolce Vita 2 years before I Tre Volti was shot. The concentration of filmmakers, writers, actors, and the international press that covered them. The specific mixture of artistic ambition and social pleasure that characterized the city's cultural life in that period. Soraya moved through this world with more ease than she had moved through the courts and diplomatic receptions of her imperial years, partly because its social rules were less formal, and partly because the people in it were, in general, less interested in her as a function than as a person, or at least less openly organized around using her for a specific purpose. It was in this environment, in the early 1960s, that she met Franco Indovina. Indovina was a German-Italian filmmaker, born in Germany, working in Italy, connected to the Roman film world through his own projects and through the networks that the industry produced. He was educated, professionally serious in the way that people who work in film by genuine vocation rather than commercial calculation are serious, and he was interested in Soraya in terms that, by all the accounts available, were personal rather than professional. He was not trying to cast her. He was not interested in her face as a commercial instrument. He was interested in her. The relationship that developed between them is the subject of the following chapter, but Its beginning is relevant here because of what it followed. It followed the film that had not worked, the career that had not materialized, the decade of managed displacement in European cities. It followed 7 years inside an institution that had organized her existence around a purpose she had not set, and that had then removed her when she failed to fulfill it. It followed the allowance and the apartments and the photographers and the covers and the carefully maintained surface of a life that was materially complete and experientially hollow. When she encountered something that was not organized around her image, not interested in her function, not calibrated to the requirements of an institution or a press narrative, when she encountered someone who was simply and directly interested in her, the contrast with everything that had preceded it was absolute. She was in her late 20s. She had been looked at, managed, photographed, assessed, treated, announced, and released. She had been an empress, a patient, a public image, a film subject, and an exile with a stipend. She had not, in any of these configurations, been simply known by another person in the way that the word known implies. The gradual, unstructured, unobserved accumulation of one person's reality by another person who has no institutional interest in the outcome. The relationship with Indovina would be that, for a time. What it could not be, given the conditions surrounding her life, was uncomplicated. The complications were not dramatic in the conventional sense. They were structural. The same kind of structural complications that had organized every other aspect of her existence since she was 17 years old. And a mutual acquaintance had arranged for her photograph to be seen by people close to the Shah. The structures did not stop operating simply because she had left the palace. They had simply become less visible. Less visible was not the same as absent, and the years ahead would make the distinction plain. Franco Indovina was 34 years old when he and Soraya began spending time together in Rome in the early 1960s. He was Sicilian by origin, German-educated and working in the Italian film industry at a level that was serious without being commercially prominent, the level at which a filmmaker has genuine artistic ambitions and sufficient professional credibility to pursue them, without the kind of public visibility that would make his private life a subject of press interest on its own terms. He was, in other words, a private person in the way that Soraya had not been permitted to be for more than a decade. His name meant nothing to the wire services. His photograph had never appeared on a magazine cover. He moved through Rome without being followed. The asymmetry of their public existences was total, and it shaped the relationship from the beginning in ways that were not immediately apparent but that accumulated significance over time. When they were together in public, at a restaurant, at a film screening, at the kind of social gathering that constituted the Roman cultural world they both moved through, she was the subject of attention and he was the person beside her. The photographers who found them noted her, photographed her, and included him in the frame as an unnamed companion, a presence identified only by his proximity to the face that the camera was actually interested in. He was, in the visual grammar of the coverage, a supporting figure in her story. Whether this was comfortable for him is not something the record addresses directly. What the record does address is that the relationship was sustained across several years, that it was the most continuous and apparently genuine personal connection of her adult life to that point, and that it existed in a condition of permanent semi-concealment that was not chosen freely by either party, but was imposed by the circumstances of who she was and what those circumstances meant in practical terms. The concealment was not complete. Their relationship was known in Rome's social and film circles, was understood by the people around them, and was occasionally referenced obliquely in the press coverage of Soraya during this period. But it was never publicly acknowledged by her in explicit terms, as never named as what it was, never given the social form that would have made it a recognized fact rather than a known but unconfirmed circumstance. The reasons for this were not mysterious. The allowance from Tehran was one reason. The Shah had remarried in 1959 and had a son and heir by 1960. The dynasty was secure, the succession was resolved, and the institutional interest in Soraya's conduct had technically diminished. But the financial dependency had not diminished. The monthly transfer from the imperial treasury continued, and the unspoken conditions attached to it continued with it. A public relationship with a man, a named, acknowledged, a photographed relationship of the kind that might lead to marriage or cohabitation would have represented a declaration of independence from the managed dignity that the court's financial arrangement implicitly required her to maintain. It would have generated press coverage that the Shah, now married to Farah and publicly content, would have found, at minimum, inconvenient. The coverage would have been framed inevitably in terms of the comparison. The new empress who had succeeded where Soraya had not, the old empress who was now conducting a romance in Rome. The framing would have been humiliating in ways that reflected on the Shah as much as on her, and the Shah's capacity to respond to humiliation through the mechanism he controlled, the monthly allowance, was not a theoretical possibility. And it was a practical fact that shaped her choices without requiring explicit threats. So the relationship with Indovina existed in the space that these constraints permitted. It was real. That much is clear from the accounts of people who knew them during this period, from the duration of the connection, from the specific quality of her behavior during the years they were together, which, by multiple accounts, was more settled, more present, more genuinely at ease than at any other point in her European exile. It was real, and it was invisible in the public sense, and the invisibility was not incidental to its existence, but structural to it. There were things she wanted that the relationship could not provide, or that the conditions surrounding her life prevented the relationship from providing. Marriage was one of them. She had not said this publicly, but her memoir and the interviews she gave in the early 1960s to European journalists returned with some regularity to the question of what she wanted, and what she returned to, with a consistency that reads as genuine rather than performed, was the desire for children. Not an heir in the dynastic sense. Children in the ordinary sense. A family, a household organized around people rather than protocol. The particular form of continuity and meaning that children represent for people who have no other form of institutional continuity. The medical assessments from the Frankfurt consultation in 1957 and its predecessors had not definitively concluded that she could not conceive. The language used in the surviving accounts is probabilistic rather than absolute, but the years had passed. And the relationship with Indovina did not produce a pregnancy, and the desire for children that she continued to express in interviews became, as the 1960s progressed, another form of absence. Another thing that her situation had not delivered and showed no signs of delivering. She was managing, during this period, several distinct layers of loss simultaneously, though managing is perhaps the wrong word for a process that was less active than that. More like the ongoing fact of a wound that does not close. The loss of the imperial role, with all its constraints, had not been replaced by anything of equivalent organizing force. The film career had not materialized. The relationship with Indovina was real, but unnamed and structurally limited. The children she wanted were not present and showed no sign of arriving. The allowance arrived. The apartments were inhabited. The photographers found her. She was photographed in Cannes in 1964 in a white dress on the Croisette, and the photograph is one of the more striking images of her from this period. She is 32, and the quality of her appearance is different from the wedding photographs in a way that goes beyond the obvious passage of time. In the wedding photographs, she is composed in the way of someone who has been prepared to be composed. In the Cannes photograph, she is composed in the way of someone who has learned, through sustained practice under difficult conditions, to keep the internal state from reaching the surface. The difference is small and entirely in the eyes. The same year, her memoir was published. She had written it in French with assistance, and it had been published initially in German. Deutschland, as the title in that edition had it, before appearing in French and Italian editions. The memoir covered her childhood, her years as empress, the divorce, and the years immediately following. It was not a confessional document. It did not name the people who had been unkind to her inside the court, did not specify the medical details of her fertility treatments, did not address the financial conditions of the allowance, and did not mention Indovina by name or implication. It was a carefully bounded account, honest within the limits it had set for itself, which were the limits that the conditions of her existence permitted. The reception of the memoir was significant in commercial terms. It sold well across Europe, where her story had been followed for over a decade and where the memoir offered the first extended account of the imperial years in her own voice. The coverage of the publication was extensive. Interviews were conducted. Photographs were taken of her with the book. The image of the former empress now appearing as the author of her own story had a certain symbolic weight that the coverage duly noted. What the coverage did not address, because the memoir did not address it, was what her life actually looked like in 1964. The apartment, the allowance, the unnamed relationship with a filmmaker whose presence in her life the book did not acknowledge. The memoir had given the world an account of the past without providing any account of the present, and which was the part of her life that was actually happening and that the carefully managed surface of the public image continued to obscure. The year 1966 arrived with the relationship still continuing, still unnamed, still operating within the structural constraints that had defined it from the beginning. Indovina's career had developed. He had made several films, had established himself more firmly in the Italian industry, had a professional existence of his own that was independent of her, and that gave him a form of daily purpose and social identity that she did not have in equivalent terms. The gap between their situations, his purposeful, hers structurally purposeless beyond the maintenance of her own image, was not the kind of gap that a personal relationship can bridge indefinitely. It can be managed. Chai can be set aside in the specific texture of private time together. But it reasserts itself in the accumulated weight of years in which one person is moving through a life and another is occupying one. She had been occupying, rather than moving through, since March 1958. By the mid-1960s, she had been occupying for the better part of a decade. And then, in the spring of 1972, Franco Indovina boarded an Alitalia flight from Rome to Palermo. The aircraft, Flight 112, crashed into the Tyrrhenian Sea on May 5, 1972, killing all 115 people aboard. The cause was subsequently determined to be a bomb placed on the aircraft by the neo-fascist terrorist organization Ordine Nuovo, as part of a broader campaign of political violence that characterized Italy's Anni di Piombo, the years of lead. Indovina was 43 years old. Soraya was 39. She did not issue a public statement. There was no official acknowledgement of her loss from her side or from anyone speaking on her behalf, because the relationship had never been officially acknowledged and there was no public framework within which a statement could be made. The press covered the crash extensively. It was a major terrorist incident, and Indovina's name appeared in the passenger lists that were published. His connection to Soraya was known in Rome's social circles and was mentioned in some Italian coverage. In the broader international press, it did not register as a significant element of the story. She was in Paris when it happened. She remained in Paris afterward. The allowance continued to arrive. The apartment on the Avenue Montaigne continued to be inhabited. There was no funeral she could attend in any capacity that the public framework of her life recognized. There was no grief that the image she had maintained for 14 years had a category for. There was no language available to her in the public register she had always been required to operate in for what had happened and what it meant. She was 39 years old, and the one sustained, private, genuinely personal connection her adult life had produced had ended on a flight from Rome to Palermo on a Tuesday in May in circumstances that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the random violence of a political movement that had no awareness of her existence. The apartment in Paris was very quiet after that. By the early 1970s, the contrast between Soraya's life in Paris and the life of Faradiba inside the Iranian imperial court had become one of those quiet, structural ironies that no one was required to articulate because its shape was sufficiently obvious. Farah had done what Soraya had not. She had produced a male heir within a year of the marriage, and then 3 more children after that, 2 sons and 2 daughters, a family whose existence had resolved the dynastic question so completely that it had ceased to be a question at all. She had also developed, over the course of the 1960s, an independent public role that went beyond the ceremonial functions Soraya had performed. She was involved in cultural patronage, in educational initiatives, and in the specific kind of visible, charitable work that gave an empress a public identity beyond her proximity to the Shah. She was photographed, as Soraya had been photographed, but the photographs told a different story, a story of function, of purpose, of a woman who was in the institution and of it rather than merely decorating its edges. Soraya was 40 years old in 1972 and had been outside the institution for 14 years. The institution had continued without her and had, by any observable measure, continued successfully. The problem she had represented had been solved. Her replacement had performed. The dynasty had an heir and then a spare and then additional children whose existence underlined the completeness of the resolution. There was nothing in the current state of the Iranian imperial court that required Soraya's existence to be acknowledged, addressed, or considered in any operational sense. The allowance continued to arrive, which was the one material thread connecting her to Tehran. It arrived not because the court was thinking about her, but because the arrangements made in 1958 had been set in motion and continued to operate by institutional momentum. It was a standing order, not an ongoing act of attention. She was aware of this. The awareness had a specific quality that is different from ordinary knowledge. It was the awareness of someone who has been categorized and filed and whose category has been closed, living in the gap between the category's persistence and its irrelevance. She had been the failed empress and then the exiled empress, and those categories had defined her public identity for over a decade. By the early 1970s, the categories were still nominally present, but the urgency that had given them their earlier weight had dissipated entirely. Iran had moved on. The court had moved on. The Shah had moved on in the most explicit possible sense. What Soraya had not fully moved on from was more difficult to specify and more difficult to discuss, because the public image she had maintained required a presentation of equanimity that precluded direct acknowledgement of ongoing difficulty. The interviews she gave during this period, and she continued to give interviews, because the press continued to ask for them and because they were one of the few forms of public existence available to her, maintained the tone of dignified acceptance that had characterized her public communications since 1958. She spoke about her life in Paris. She spoke about travel. She spoke about friends, about interests, about the pleasures of a private life after years of public obligation. The interviewers listened and wrote down what she said and published it alongside photographs that showed her still beautiful, still composed, still wearing the right clothes. The interviews did not discuss Indovina, who had been dead for several years by the time the early 1970s interviews were being conducted. They did not discuss the allowance or the conditions attached to it, or the specific quality of the financial dependency on a man who had divorced her and remarried and had 4 children and was running a country. They did not discuss what the preceding 14 years had actually felt like from the inside of them. What the interviews sometimes touched, obliquely, was the question of children. She returned to it with the consistency of someone who cannot entirely leave a subject alone, even when they have decided not to speak directly about it. She had wanted children. She still wanted them, or the wanting had become so structural a part of her self-understanding that it persisted, even past the point at which it could be acted on. She was in her early 40s. The medical consultations were long over. The question had answered itself by accumulation of time, if nothing else. But she mentioned it in careful, general terms, without self-pity and without drama, in a way that the interviewers noted and that the published pieces registered as a recurring theme in her public self-presentation. The Shah, during this same period, was at the peak of his political power and international visibility. The oil wealth generated by OPEC's 1973 price increases had given him resources to pursue the rapid modernization program he had been implementing since the early 1960s, and Iran's strategic position had made him a figure of significant importance in American foreign policy calculations. He was being photographed and interviewed and received at the highest levels of international diplomacy. He appeared on the covers of Time and other major international publications. He gave interviews in which he spoke about Iran's future, about modernization, about the White Revolution he had announced in 1963. He was, in the language of early 1970s, geopolitics, a figure of consequence. The contrast with Soraya's situation was not something either of them was required to address publicly. It was simply the visible structure of two lives that had been connected for 7 years and had then separated, with one continuing to expand and the other contracting into a fixed pattern of apartments and allowances and photographs that documented an image rather than a life. There were letters. The existence of correspondence between Soraya and the Shah after the divorce is attested in several sources, though the full content and extent of this correspondence has never been made public. But what is known is that contact between them was not entirely severed after March 1958, that there were communications through intermediaries and apparently sometimes directly that maintained a thread of connection between them across the years of separation. The nature of these communications is described differently by different sources. Some accounts suggest they were primarily administrative, concerning the allowance and its terms. Others suggest they were more personal in content, reflecting the affection that both of them had acknowledged during the marriage, and that the divorce had not entirely dissolved. The Iranian government, after the 1979 revolution, had obvious reasons to characterize the former Shah's relationships and conduct in unflattering terms, and some of the accounts of the correspondence that emerged after 1979 carry that context and should be read with it in mind. The pre-revolutionary accounts from people who were close to the court during the 1960s and 1970s are more varied in their characterization but agree on the basic fact of ongoing contact. What this correspondence represented for Soraya, practically and emotionally, is a matter of inference rather than documented record. She was financially dependent on the man she was corresponding with. She had spent 7 years in genuine proximity to him, in a marriage that, whatever its structural foundations had, also contained the ordinary texture of shared daily life. He had fathered no children with her, had divorced her, had remarried, had had children with his new wife and built a life that did not include her. But she had built no equivalent life. The correspondence, whatever its content, was a thread connecting her to the only sustained institutional existence she had ever had, a thread that was thin and that she held by courtesy of his continued willingness to maintain the allowance. In 1978, the first signs of the revolutionary movement that would end the Pahlavi dynasty were becoming impossible to ignore. Street protests in Tehran, some of them involving hundreds of thousands of people, were occurring with increasing frequency. The Shah's political position, which had seemed so solid through the early and middle 1970s, was deteriorating with a speed that surprised most Western observers and many Iranians. By the autumn of 1978, it was becoming clear to people close to the court that the situation was not a manageable political crisis of the kind the Shah had navigated before, but something of a different order entirely. Soraya was in Paris when the revolution began to accelerate. She followed the events through the French press, which covered them extensively as the crisis deepened through the winter of 1978 and into January 1979. She would have understood, as the coverage made unmistakable, what the collapse of the Shah's government would mean for the financial arrangement that had supported her existence for 20 years. The allowance was paid from the imperial treasury. The imperial treasury's future was becoming, through the winter of 1978, an open question. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran. He flew to Egypt and then onward through a series of countries: Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico, the United States, Panama, Egypt again, in the particular itinerary of an exile who has not yet found a place willing to receive him permanently. The journey had a quality that was not entirely unlike Soraya's departure from Tehran in March 1958. a person leaving a country they had inhabited as its central figure, moving toward a Europe and an America that would receive them as spectacle rather than as sovereign. The Shah was dying. He had been diagnosed with lymphoma in 1973, a fact that had been kept from the public and from most of his court for years, and the illness had progressed through the 1970s in the background of his political difficulties. When he left Iran in January 1979, he was not well, and the conditions of the exile that followed, the constant movement, the political uncertainty, the collapse of the dynasty he had spent his life maintaining, were not conditions under which a sick man improved. Soraya was in Paris. The allowance, which had arrived monthly for 21 years, stopped. She had known it might stop. She had understood the dependency clearly enough to have known, as the revolutionary movement gained force through 1978, that the financial arrangement was contingent on the continuation of the institution that funded it. She had nevertheless not constructed an alternative, had not, in the 21 years of the allowance, built a financial independence sufficient to maintain her life without it. The apartments, the travel, the clothes, the maintenance of the image. These had consumed the income as it arrived, which is what happens when income is understood as permanent rather than precarious. The Shah died in Cairo on July 27, 1980. He was 60 years old. The coverage of his death was extensive. Obituaries in every major publication, assessments of his reign, reflections on the revolution that had ended it. Soraya was mentioned in several of these pieces in the context of the brief account of his marriages that the biographical sections required. She was the second wife, the one who had been unable to provide an heir. The role she had played in the dynastic narrative was noted and summarized in a sentence or two. She did not issue a public statement about his death. There was no framework in which a statement from her would have had a clear social meaning. She was not his widow, not his family, not a figure in the political story of the revolution. She was a woman he had been married to for 7 years, who had been receiving his money for 21 years, and who was now in Paris without either the marriage or the money. She was 47 years old. The years after 1980 did not have the external structure that the preceding decades had possessed, not even the negative structure of the allowance and its conditions, not even the thin thread of correspondence with Tehran. What remained was the apartment, the image, the photographers who still occasionally found her, and the accumulated habit of a life that had been organized for so long around managing its own surface that the surface had become, in some functional sense, the whole thing. She was 47 years old when the Shah died and the allowance ceased. The financial situation required adjustment, and she made adjustments. The details of how she managed the transition from the imperial stipend to whatever came after it are not thoroughly documented. She did not discuss her finances publicly, maintained the discretion about money that her entire adult life had practiced, and the accounts that exist are partial and sometimes contradictory. What is clear is that she did not become destitute. She had jewelry, the personal pieces from the marriage years, which were hers and which represented considerable value. She had the apartment. She had the continuing, if diminished, interest of the press, which translated into occasional paid appearances, interviews for which fees were paid, the residual commercial value of an image that had been circulating for 30 years. She sold some jewelry. She reduced some expenses. The Avenue Montaigne apartment, which had been maintained at a level consistent with imperial expectations, was recalibrated to a level consistent with the income actually available. The recalibration was practical and apparently accomplished without visible crisis, which was consistent with the competence at surface management she had developed across decades of practice. What the financial adjustment could not address was the question of what the days were for. This question had been present in varying degrees of urgency since 1958, but it had always been managed by the allowance, which gave the days a minimal organizing purpose. They were days that were funded, days that would be followed by more funded days, days that existed within a financial structure that gave them a context even when they had no content. Without the allowance, the days lost even that minimal organizational frame and became simply time, unstructured, unobligated, accumulating. She was not entirely without social engagement. The Paris of the 1980s and 1990s had its own networks of displaced aristocracy, wealthy expatriates, and figures from the cultural world who knew her and continued to know her. People she had met during the decades of European social circulation who remained in contact in the loose, intermittent way of long acquaintance. She attended some functions. She was seen at some openings and dinners. Should the photographs from this period show a woman in her 50s and then her 60s who has aged in the specific way of someone who has maintained their appearance as a professional obligation for decades, carefully with evident effort against the grain rather than with it. The press continued to return to her periodically, as it returns to all figures whose stories have the structure of tragedy. The beautiful woman who was displaced, who lost the one private connection she had allowed herself, who lived out the decades in apartments in cities that were not her own. The narrative the press had constructed around her was durable, precisely because it was simple and because it had a clear arc with a satisfying, if melancholy, shape. The photographers who found her in her 60s were working in the same tradition as the photographers who had found her at 25 at the airport in Tehran, pointing the same cameras at the same face with the same implicit question: what does it look like now? The answer the photographs gave was complicated in the way that faces are complicated when they have been looked at long enough and closely enough. She was still recognizable as the woman in the wedding photographs. The structure was the same. What had accumulated on the structure across 50 years was not what the fairy tale narrative the press had always preferred would have predicted. It was not ruin, not collapse, not the visible devastation that tragedy in its literary form requires. Oh, it was something quieter and in some ways more difficult to articulate, the look of a person who has been present for their own life without being able to fully inhabit it. In the 1990s, she gave a small number of interviews that were more candid than the managed public communications of the earlier decades. The interviewers who sat with her in Paris in this period, she was in her 60s, the Shah had been dead for 15 years, the Iranian Revolution had reconfigured the political context in ways that removed some of the earlier constraints on what she could say, found a woman who spoke more directly about the marriage, about the pressure of the heir question, about the divorce than she had allowed herself to speak in earlier decades. The directness was not dramatic. She did not perform grievance or seek sympathy, and she spoke in the same restrained, analytical tone that had characterized her public voice since 1958. But she spoke more completely, with fewer of the careful omissions that the earlier interviews had maintained. She said, in one of these late interviews, that she had understood from early in the marriage that she was inside an institution rather than a relationship, and that the understanding had arrived not through a single realization, but through the accumulation of small observations, the way information moved around her rather than to her, the way decisions were made and then communicated to her as facts rather than discussed with her as questions, the way the people who served her were accountable to the court rather than to her. She said this, without apparent bitterness, as a description rather than a complaint, as in the manner of someone reporting on a historical situation they have had decades to examine and have come to understand with a clarity that coexists, uncomfortably, with the knowledge that the understanding arrived too late to be useful. She said also, in this period, that she had never stopped wanting children. The statement was not accompanied by elaboration. She said it, and moved on to the next subject, in the manner of someone mentioning a fact that is too large for the conversational space available to it, and that is better stated briefly than developed. The apartment she inhabited in the final years of her life was in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, a quieter, more residential neighborhood than the Avenue Montaigne of her earlier Parisian decades, so its streets populated by the kind of old money and established professional families for whom a former Iranian empress living nearby was not an object of particular attention. The apartment was smaller than the earlier ones and was inhabited in the way of someone who has been reducing the material footprint of their life gradually over years. Fewer objects, less maintenance of the imperial surface, a domestic space that had contracted toward the actually inhabited rather than the appropriately displayed. She was found there, on October 25th, 2001. She had been dead for several days before she was found. She was 69 years old. The cause of death was determined to be a fall. She had fallen in the apartment, apparently alone, and had not been discovered until her housekeeper arrived and could not reach her by the usual means. But the manner of her death was reported across the international press within hours of the discovery. The coverage had a quality that was consistent with the coverage of her life: extensive, photograph-heavy, organized around the narrative of beauty and tragedy and loss that had structured the story since 1958. The photographs that ran with the death notices were mostly from the 1950s and early 1960s. The wedding photographs, the photographs from the airport in Tehran, the photographs from Cannes and Rome and Paris in the years of the exile. They showed the face the world had decided to associate with her name, the face at the age at which it had been most consistently photographed, the face of the Empress rather than the face of the 69-year-old woman who had been found alone in a Paris apartment after several days. Now, there was an estate, the apartment and its contents, the remaining jewelry that had not been sold, the personal effects accumulated over decades of European residence. These constituted an estate that became, in the months following her death, the subject of legal proceedings involving various claimants. The details of the estate dispute are not thoroughly documented in the public record, but its existence is consistent with the pattern of her adult life. The financial arrangements surrounding her were always managed by institutions and intermediaries rather than by her own direct control, and the management of what she left behind followed the same pattern. Her papers, to the extent they existed, correspondence, personal documents, the record of a private life conducted in semi-concealment for decades, were not made public in any organized form. If there were letters that documented what the carefully maintained public image had not permitted her to express, they did not emerge into the historical record in any comprehensive way. What the archive contains is what it has always contained: the photographs, the public interviews, the memoir, the film, the official record of the marriage and the divorce, and the public engagements in between. The private record, if it exists anywhere, has not been made available. The Iranian government, which by 2001 had been the Islamic Republic for 22 years, made no official statement about her death. She was the former empress of a dynasty the revolution had abolished. Maishsek and her death required no acknowledgement from a government whose founding act had been the overthrow of the institution she had briefly represented. She was buried in Munich, in the Westfriedhof Cemetery, in the country of her mother's family, the German half of her identity, the half that had made her useful to the imperial court as a symbol of cosmopolitan modernity, and that had made her, in the court's private conversations, slightly suspect as insufficiently Iranian. The grave is not an elaborate one. It is, by the accounts of people who have visited it, a simple marker in a large municipal cemetery without the grandeur that the 1951 wedding photographs might lead a visitor to expect. The photographs, meanwhile, have continued their independent existence on the covers of books about Iranian history, and in documentaries about the Pahlavi dynasty, in the visual archives of wire services that still license them to publications running retrospectives about the 20th century's vanished royal courts. The face in them is still striking. The story attached to it is still told in the Register of Beauty and Tragedy that the press established in 1958 and has maintained ever since. Whether the story being told is the story of the woman in the photographs, or the story of what the photographs required her to be, is a question the photographs themselves cannot answer. The 1951 wedding photograph still circulates. It appears in books, in documentary footage, in the visual shorthand of pieces about mid-century glamour or the vanished world of 20th century monarchy. The woman in it is 18 years old, in a dress that weighs 40 pounds, standing in a palace built by her husband's father to project the permanence of a dynasty that would last another 28 years. She outlived the dynasty by 22 years. She outlived the Shah by 21. She outlived Franco-Indovina by 29. She outlived, by several decades, the institutional role that had been the organizing fact of her adult existence. And she lived out those decades in apartments in cities that received her as an image without particular interest in the person the image had been made from. What the photograph did not show was available, if imperfectly, in the record she left behind. The memoir, written in careful French, the interviews conducted over 40 years in which the same subjects returned with the regularity of things that cannot be resolved and therefore cannot be left alone, shots the film that documented her face without reaching what was behind it. The record is partial. The private correspondence has not been published. The papers from the apartment in the 16th arrondissement have not been made available. The full account of what her life felt like from the inside of it remains, in any documentary sense, incomplete. What is complete is the external record. The photographs, the announcements, the official engagements, the press coverage that followed her from Tehran to Rome to Paris across 5 decades, without ever quite arriving at the person it was ostensibly documenting. The external record is extraordinarily thorough. It covers nearly every public appearance she made from 1951 to the late 1990s. It documents her clothes, her companions, her destinations, her expressions. It is a record of sustained looking that somehow managed, across all its decades and all its images, to produce very little actual seeing. She wanted children and did not have them. She wanted a life that was hers and lived most of it inside structures that organized her existence around purposes she had not set. She had the one private connection her adult life produced taken from her by a bomb on a flight from Rome to Palermo, and she did not have a public framework within which to grieve it. She was found alone in her apartment after several days. These are facts. They do not add up to a lesson. They do not resolve into a shape that the word tragedy fully covers, because tragedy implies a fall from a height that was genuinely occupied, and it is not entirely clear that she ever fully occupied the height the photographs show her at. What they add up to is a life, specific, documented in many of its most important dimensions and visible, that the world watched for 50 years and largely did not see. The photograph still circulates. The dress still weighs 40 pounds. The woman who wore it has been in the Westfriedhof Cemetery in Munich since October 2001, in a grave that does not look like the wedding photograph suggested it would. What she thought about in the apartment in the 16th arrondissement in the years before the fall, that is not in the record.